Hi everyone. I wanted to get started with Beyond Christianity After Religion this week just by coming to you this way by video. This is just going to be a short presentation to kick things off. Christianity After Religion was written here in my cottage. It was actually the first book that was written in this building. And I was working on it in 2010 and 2011. So that means I was sitting in this chair at this desk 13 years ago writing this book. And a lot has happened since then, including the fact that I had not gone back and reread the book in its entirety. Probably in 8 or 9 years. It's been a long time since I sat down with this text, the text that I actually wrote. And so I wanted to start with my favorite question, which I shared with you just a few weeks ago on Sunday Musings, and that is, what most surprised you by this particular reading? And so this week we're going to focus on the introduction and the first section of the book, the first 3 chapters. And that's where I spent a lot of my time thinking about those particular chapters and asking myself over and over again, what surprises me about this? The first thing that surprises me is that when you come to something that you once wrote, but you haven't read in a really long time, it almost feels like you're not the author. So it was a strange sensation reading a book and thinking, wow, I really like this book. I find myself agreeing with it. And then I just started laughing. Well, I'm glad I do, because I actually wrote it. So that was a bit of a surprise for me, to be able to have distanced myself from my own work and then return to it and find it to be a pleasant, intellectual surprise, just how enjoyable an experience it was. Because usually I'm a little bit like reading my own books as I am with seeing myself on video, or the few times I've been on television. I almost cannot watch myself because I'm constantly thinking, what would I do differently? So it was pleasant to engage ideas that I cared about passionately enough to put on the page, and now find myself re-engaged with in ways that are rewarding. And so that's a great surprise. The second surprise approaching the introduction and the first 3 chapters was how little I thought there was to actually change. I had anticipated that there would be a whole bunch of information in this first section of the book that I would want to go back to and say, oh, this is completely different, or these statistics were absolutely wrong. In the Wednesday newsletter, when you get my first written piece, I'll say more about that. But it just sort of as a first taste of how I'm approaching the book, that was a surprise. It was a surprise to me how it held up. So the first surprise was how much I enjoyed revisiting my own work. And the second surprise was, wow, there's a lot here that is still true today, and perhaps even truer. So those were my two major surprises. This video, I want to just underscore a couple things for you as you move into thinking about Christianity After Religion. I know a whole lot of you are rereading or reading the book for the first time. You don't have to read the book if you don't want to. These little videos and our conversations will alert you to enough information along the way. You'll be able to get a lot out of it. But it is also helpful, I think, that if you are reading it, to hear me fill out certain parts of the story a little bit more for you. And the one part of this section that I want to underscore, outline in yellow marker, make sure that you pay attention to, is near the beginning of the book, in the late 20s. Begins on page 28 and moves a few pages beyond that. And that is the definition laid out of the word awakening by William McLaughlin. I've got here, right with me, this very old copy of Revivals, Awakenings, and Reform. And this was one of the first books that I read in graduate school in 1987. Oh my gosh, that's such a long time ago now. But I took a class on fundamentalism and evangelicalism with George Marsden. It was my very first semester at Duke University. And this was one of the texts that was required for that class. A few of you may have heard me say this in the past. Excuse me, I've been having allergies all day today. Is that when I read this book for the very first time, I did not like it. As a matter of fact, someplace in some file, probably my files or George Marsden's old files, unless he's thrown them all out, there is my book review of this, and it is scathing. I couldn't stomach it when I was in my late 20s in grad school. And part of the reason why I found it so difficult to stomach is that William McLaughlin, he himself is an American Baptist, a very interesting man with a great background. He taught for many years at Brown University, so he was an Ivy League American religious historian. And when you see the title of a book called Revivals, Awakenings, and Reform, you might think to yourself, oh my gosh, this is about like how to have an awakening or how to have a revival, especially, like I said, if he's a Baptist. But it's not that at all. It's published by the University of Chicago Press, and it was just a sociological, historical analysis of what constitutes an awakening in American history. So he used sociological and anthropological tools to go back and look at the history of awakenings, and then to project, as it were, the possibility of awakening while he was writing the book, and then again into the future. So this particular little book was written about 10 years before I first read it. So it was written in the mid to late 70s. I believe that it was written when Jimmy Carter was still president of the United States. And as you will find out from the book, and perhaps, like I said, some of you have heard me talk about it before, William McLaughlin talks about the three great awakenings in American religious history. Those would have been in the 1740s, the early 1800s, and then right around the turn of the 20th century, the 1880s to about 1910, 1920. Then he postulated in this book that America had gone through a fourth great awakening in the post-war period, beginning around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, moving through the 1960s and through the 70s. And he speculated that the thing that he thought was the fourth great awakening was potentially coming to an end while he was writing this little book. So it is a mix of history and sociology. And I was sort of appalled by it because I was a very conservative evangelical at the time, and it's not theological. It's cultural, analytical. And so it was a long time before I could really think about American religious history and religion more larger, in a larger sense, in quite these kinds of analytical and academic terms. But when I returned to this book, right as I was writing Christianity After Religion, I was astonished. I thought that the definitions were really helpful, and the pattern that he laid out was revelatory. I literally picked up this book, started rereading it, and I felt as if I was watching the news. Now, like I said, that would have been some 13 years ago. William McLaughlin has long since passed away, so I don't know what he would think about contemporary events. There are 2 points from the beginning of my book that I replicate from his book that I just mentioned, or in the late pages of the late 20s, 28 onward. And these are really important points for you to just hold in mind as we enter into this discussion. If you are going to read, like I said, it will be really helpful. You can just sort of underscore and see these in front of you. And if you are just listening to me, I will do my best to make this clear. You can leave comments and ask some questions down at the bottom of this post, and I will try to get to them as I'm able between the time you receive this newsletter and the time we meet on Wednesday. So the 2 things that I want you to underline from William McLaughlin as you're thinking this week about revivals and awakenings, the end of church and the beginning of a new spiritual awakening, the subtitle of Christianity After Religion. McLaughlin makes a distinction between revival and awakening, and I can't think of anything that's been more confusing for my readers than conflating those 2 terms. A revival is not an awakening. A revival is a discrete event that happens with some regularity in certain kinds of religious settings. And what a revival is geared towards the renewal of the life of an individual, maybe giving yourself to Jesus all over again, speaking in tongues, having some sort of experience of complete sanctification. There's lots of different ways that revivals are conceptualized in American Protestantism. And they happen when there are revival meetings, or they happen when there are big evangelistic sort of crusades that come to town. Sometimes they happen in seasons. There are certain denominations that have seasons of revival. And what usually is the result of a revival are individual conversions and sometimes the growth of individual congregations. And so revivals are geared towards the transformation of individuals and the growth of particular kinds of revivalistic churches. A revival may be part of an awakening. And there are other kinds of revivals as well than the ones we certainly think about. My high church friends will think about the fact that we've had a liturgical revival, where it's, in effect, it's a little like a classic revival, where you go back and you sort of grab a set of liturgies or patterns of Christian renewal from the past. In this case, for liturgical types, it would be the Eucharist or a new emphasis on baptism or something to that effect. So you go back and you pick up that old thing. For Baptists, it's the sawdust trail, or Pentecostals, it's learning how to speak in tongues. And you reapply it in a new situation in order to bring new life to individuals or congregations. So that's generally what a revival is. An awakening is not that. And this is the definition that that McLaughlin lays out, that I repeat in Christianity After Religion. And if there's one thing that you remember from this little video today, please do remember this. McLaughlin writes, revivals and awakenings occur in all culture. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to back up a little bit because that comes a little later. Okay, so from the bottom of page 28. Revivals are essentially rituals of personal religious renewal that are often emotional and always involve a conversion of some sort. Revivals may stand on their own, as the yearly meeting at a Baptist or Pentecostal church, or a massive Billy Graham meeting. Yeah, this is before Billy Graham died. Or they may be a subset of awakening. And then he goes on. An awakening is a much larger cultural event. Awakenings are movements of cultural revitalization that, and this is an exact quote from his book, eventuate in basic restructuring of our institutions and redefinitions of our social goals. In other words, an awakening isn't just about changing each one of us as an individual, having us meet God, having us get saved, whatever the purpose of a revival is. An awakening is a cultural transformation where everything about religion, economics, family life, society, where politics, it all changes. And he makes the point very strongly that you can go back in American history and see these very distinctive kinds of moments in which you could say, before these set of events occurred, the United States was like X, and then after this set of events occurred, it was like Y. And that is what a cultural awakening is. It's cultural transformation, not just individual transformation. And so then he goes on, and this is the part that I started to quote a moment ago. As McLaughlin writes, revivals and awakenings occur in all cultures. They are essentially folk movements, the means by which a people or nation reshapes its identity, transforms its patterns of thought and action, and sustains a healthy relationship with environmental and social change. And then he goes on and says a little bit more here. Awakenings begin when old systems break down in periods of cultural distortion and grave personal stress, when we lose the faith in the legitimacy of our norms, the viability of our institutions, and the authority of our leaders in church and state. What happens during an awakening is you get what he calls a critical disjunction in how we see ourselves, God, and the world. And all of this arises from cultural stress. This is the sign that the old pattern, the way of organizing identity and community life, is breaking down, and that it is beginning to make space for something new to occur. So as I just turn the page up to page 33, this is the other piece for you to pay attention to in your reading. He says there are 5 movements in this shift of awakening. And these are the 5 things. 1, there's a crisis of legitimacy. And that's what begins this whole process. And that he was referring to that in that quote that I just read a moment ago as well. And this is, he goes on, during a crisis of a legitimacy, individuals cannot honestly sustain the common set of religious understandings by which they believe they should act. In other words, the ways in which we perceived faith, perhaps growing up, or the way that our parents did or our grandparents did, we can't be honest about those anymore. They no longer work. And this, I fill that out a little bit on page 33. People wonder if they are the only ones who see these problems. Usually in the early stages of a crisis of legitimacy, you'll be sort of looking around and saying, is it just me? Am I the only one who feels this way? Am I nuts? What's going on here? And yet, the sense of the need to be honest grows so intensely that usually individuals wind up questioning what they've inherited and what is perceived to be conventional doctrine or practice. Okay, so that's the first step, crisis of legitimacy. The second step is a period of cultural distortion. And in this period, folks who have been going through this crisis of legitimacy begin to find one another. And once you find enough people who are feeling the same way you do about the political system, or about the religious tradition you grew up in, or about the construction of society, or about the norms of family life or gender or whatever they are, you find enough people who are having the same set of questions that you have, you then begin to realize something very important. It isn't just you, and maybe there's something wrong with our institutions. Maybe you're not the ones with the problem, but maybe it's the fact that the institutions have somehow failed. And so that's what this period of cultural distortion is all about. It's about institutional failure and the realization of us, the people who constitute a community or a church or a nation, that our institutions have malfunctioned, that they just don't work anymore. And I know actually a lot of you are upset about the Supreme Court this week, and that's a great picture of institutional malfunction. Is that all of a sudden everybody's going, well, wait a second, it's not a single case, or it's not just one goofy judge, or it's not just like some individual happens to be corrupt, or it's not that I'm just mad at them, but oh my gosh, there is real distortion happening here. There is a legitimate institutional failure. Bill McKibben had a really good piece on Sunday about institutional failure in the Supreme Court. I thought it was very good. If you read The Crucial Years, Bill McKibben's newsletter, I highly recommend it. If you do, go back and look at it, because it's a good example of step 2 in this pattern. Step 3 is that you do get to a point in this pattern where significant individuals or communities begin to say, hey, we could do things differently. And all these different groups begin suggesting different ways of organizing politics, or organizing the economy, or organizing family life, or organizing community, or organizing how we understand things like race. I mean, that's one of the things we've been going through, is that part of the cultural argument we've been having is trying to conceptualize and come to some sort of agreement on a new vision for race and American identity. And it's a really interesting process. And so that's what the third part of this pattern is like. It's very creative. It's very mealy. It's often very contentious, because when you're trying to arrive at a set of new visions, not everybody's going to agree, initially at least. There's going to be a lot of ferment, and it's very, like I said, it's very creative. And there's going to be a lot of original thinking, a lot of amazing books, a lot of interesting artists will come to the fore. That's a period of great new life in cultural history, is when all of a sudden, when you see everything has failed, and then there's space for new voices, new people, and new visions. That's the third thing, new vision. Fourth, eventually, out of that new vision, a few things will begin to stick. There will be things that people will say, hey, I never thought of it that way before. I agree with that. Gosh, I never really thought about white supremacy before, but I can see that and how that's worked out in my life, and I want to be different. Or, I really didn't know that my neighbor who is trans had this particular kind of experience of gender. I always just thought there were sort of two genders, and it never occurred to me that there might be a different way of conceptualizing even something that seems so basic. And maybe I need to think about those kinds of questions. And so the new visions, people will begin to cluster around them, and enough people will begin to build out a kind of agreement, at least in allyship or in principle, that new paths to a different kind of future begin to be forged. And so I love actually what it says on page 34. I'll just read it to you, and we're almost done with today's little video lesson. Uh, 4 says, as a new vision unfolds, small groups of people who understand the necessity for change begin to follow a new path around these different visions. They experiment, they create, they innovate with religious, political, economic, and family structures in a search for a new way of life. And I'd even put here a deeper sense of identity. They develop new practices to give life and meaning, to make the world different. They embody the new vision and invite others to do so as well. So there's a new vision, and then there's the clustering and building communities around the new vision. So that's path 3 is new visions. Path 4 is that clustering and following and putting into play new ways of being community. And then 5, institutional transformation. And this is what it says here on page 34. Institutional transformation occurs when the innovators manage to win over a large group of undecided folks who finally see the relevance of the new path and embrace the new practices. When the undecideds flip, institutional change can finally take place. As we move into this book, those are the things that I want you to think about. That difference between revivals and awakenings. We're not talking about revivals here. As a matter of fact, when there's an awakening, there's no guarantee that any particular denomination, congregation, or religious tradition will grow. As a matter of fact, some of them, in a resistance to change, will actually get smaller and die. Revivals are always about growing churches, but awakenings are about transformation of religious community and transformation of institutions. That's where you get eventually. You get to institutional transformation. And institutions that will not transform as the new visions are gaining so much in terms of public expression and the hearts of a new generation. Institutions that fail to transform will not make it, except as usually some sort of antique from the past. You can have sort of smaller kinds of institutions that hang on a little bit in a sort of a nostalgia or a boutique fashion rather than genuine institutional transformation. But in an awakening, a large part of the population will finally say, we want these new ways. This is the way we see forward. And we are going to change everything to get there. And so that's what an awakening is. Awakening is about cultural and institutional transformation and the path, the hard path that it takes to get there in both our social institutions and our religious institutions. And so that's what we're going to be talking about during July. Like I said, this is not really going to be a class. I don't want it to be that formal. It's not summer school. I want to be at the beach too. As a matter of fact, I'll be a wild goose one of the times when I'm doing some of the presentations and writing for you all. So Wild Goose is a festival in North Carolina of progressive religious folks who get together at a big campground, and it'll be, some of you I know go. Those of you who don't go, I want you to understand it's like a big outdoor camping party for progressive Christians. So anyway, that's what we're going to be talking about. I want us to think about where we've been over the course of these last 10 to 12 years. Why this crazy book still seems to resonate with so many readers. What is the same that might not have changed as much as I thought it would change in a decade, and what has changed enormously in the last decade for both good and ill. And so just keep those things in mind. Revivals are not awakenings. Revivals are about growing your church or getting converted. Awakenings are about cultural transformation, and cultural transformation, according to this wonderful, amazing theory laid out by William McLaughlin, which was based on anthropological theories from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, is that an awakening, this cultural transformation, you actually can see it in 5 distinct stages. Those stages are crisis of legitimacy, cultural distortion, new vision, following a new path, and institutional transformation. I hope you'll have, that my American listeners will have a great 4th of July. For all of our Canadian friends who just celebrated Canada Day, I hope that was really fun for you all. And for other viewers who are across the world, especially my friends in Australia and New Zealand, oh my gosh, friends in Europe, we got tons of listeners in the UK, in France, South Africa, all kinds of wonderful places. We're going to work on this together, and I mean, frankly, our French listeners, our French people at the cottage, will be saying, "Oh my gosh, they're going through some cultural transformation right now that's pretty dramatic," and so we hope we can give you some accompaniment and some encouragement, as we know that your country's facing some really difficult moments right now. So anyway, thank you all so much for being here. Like I said, keep it light, keep it informal, keep it summary. For those of you in the northern hemisphere where it is as hot as Hades, those of you in the southern hemisphere, I hope you're having a lovely winter, and we will journey together this July and try to imagine a more hopeful world, deepening our own vision, and figuring out some ways perhaps of inviting others onto a new path in what it means to be faithful people, to follow a creative, loving, embracing God, and to learn to be better global neighbors to one another. In the meantime, I think you know I love you, and I really am glad you're here.